Hello, welcome to another episode of the Capitol Record. I'm your host, David Bonson, and I'm very excited for yet another episode of your podcast here, prosecuting the fight to defend free enterprise and robust capital markets towards our aim of a free and virtuous society. And before I introduce our guest, while we're on the subject of the aim of a free and virtuous society, I want to tell you about something extremely compatible with the mission of Capitol Record, which is a full semester-long economics course, free. Free means no charge. It doesn't mean that there was a free lunch here, because it most certainly wasn't free for me to put it together, but it's free for a consumer to access it, and it is now available. Bonson Economics 101, 30 lectures, a full syllabus with links to all the reading material and other videos, quizzes, essay prompts, final exam. It's really meant to be a kind of introductory economics course in a box, all available at bonson.com, BAHNSEN.com. If I were charging for it, I wouldn't mention it here on this podcast, but it's not a commercial because it's at no cost. What it is just meant to be an informative resource, very ideological, very rooted in the philosophy of economics that I believe in, and something that I think is lacking. I designed the course for upperclassmen in high school, but I believe it's going to be very valuable for a lot of adults as well that would like to kind of discover or rediscover the basic foundational truths about economics and how we think about it here at the Capitol Record. So if this is of interest to you, check out bonson.com to see about this Economics 101 course. And if it's not of interest to you, then just keep listening to the podcast while you drive, and hopefully you'll gain some nuggets doing that as well. And you're going to get some of those nuggets here today. Another first-time guest this year, very excited to have on Dr. Steven Teles of the Johns Hopkins University. He earned his doctorate at Virginia and has been now a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center, which is doing some incredible work in this subject about the economy, the various incentives that exist that damage or limit free enterprise. He is an incredibly historically minded scholar, has done great work around not only kind of the history of conservative thought, but particularly the history of the conservative movement's relationship with this issue. And that issue is one that we have tackled many times in Capitol Record already. You recall we had Michael Munger from Duke University on earlier in the year, who I think is one of the foremost experts on the subject of rent-seeking and cronyism. It's a subject near and dear to my heart because I believe very much in unfettered free markets, and believe very much that when we fetter those free markets through rent-seeking and through the unhealthy relationship between business and government, that what we do is not merely unfair to another actor, but an undermining of the very institution we seek to build. Therefore, and by institution, I mean the institution of free enterprise. Therefore, it leads to not only a numbness or a cynicism about free markets, but ultimately, over time, I think inhibits what markets do best, which is generate growth and prosperity and outcomes and distributions. And by altering those things, we are undermining the cause we say we believe in. So Dr. Teles has a lot more to say than I do on this topic. Very eloquent thinker, writer, and I'm looking forward to bringing him on the Capitol Record right now. So with that said, allow me to welcome another first-time guest to the Capitol Record. Welcome, Steven Teles.
Thanks for having me on.
I've been excited for this. We've had it booked for a couple of weeks now, and there's been a couple of topics over the last several months I think have kind of overlapped with things that are near and dear to your heart. But maybe before we kind of get into it a little bit? Tell listeners who you are, what you're doing, and some of the issues that you've cared enough about to write and get published.
Yeah, so I'm my full-time day job is I'm a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm also a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center in DC, which is a relatively new think tank that tries to occupy you might think of as moderate or the sort of classically liberal, but ideologically sort of open space that's generally not occupied in American politics. Most of my work in the past has been on conservatism. Probably the book I'm best known for is called The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, which was based on internal papers from the Olin Foundation, the Federalist Society, the Center for Individual Rights, and I think is generally considered to be one of the more important books on the history of conservatism. I wrote a book. My last book was called Never Trump, which was on conservatives who opposed Trump and to some degree still did. And that's been a theme sort of throughout my more empirical work, is looking at the development of the conservative elite intellectual movement. And then I've also had a side that's been interested in public policy and political economy, which is more what I think we'll be talking about today.
With your understanding not only of these various issues ideologically, kind of the philosophy that exists behind conservative political economy, but then juxtaposed with your interest in it historically, do you think that when you think about a kind of sincere conservative intellectual, that they historically were embracing of crony capitalism? Do you think it was a conscious thing, that there was a kind of confusion between defending markets and defending business? Do you think that the puck moved over the years? How would you talk about that issue historically?
Yeah, so this is obviously very complicated because you have to, I edited a book called Conservatism in American Political Development a few years ago. And one of the challenges is figuring out when you start saying that actors are conservative, and are they in the same tradition as somebody like you, in the same tradition as a conservative from the 19-teens, right? Because remember, people who identified as being Republican stalwarts in the 19-teens were in favor of strict immigration control. They were in favor of very high tariffs, right? Going back in the 19th century, to some degree, they were consistent with the American system. They were in favor of, they were against antitrust, right? Because they were in favor of large industrial conglomerates. And so I actually find it hard. There are a lot of people who like the idea of thinking of that there being a conservative tradition that goes back 200 years. And I find it a lot easier to think about conservatism as we currently think of it as really something that does start in the 40s and 50s, right? Because you go back, even to someone like Herbert Hoover, I think of it as being on a particular side of progressivism, right? And this was Jonah Goldberg's podcast, right? I would say that actually that there was a space between Wilson and Hoover that actually was a progressive space, right? And some of that then later on becomes conservative, right? But a lot of those same actors thought of themselves as progressive because they were opposed to urban machines. They wanted to create a big national, single national economy. So I would say that the other thing to say is that conservatism and the Republican Party are not the same thing, right? So the Republican Party has had a pretty significant relationship to business, in some ways going back further than the rise of modern conservatism, right? That's been what you might think of as an anchor tenant in the building of conservatism. And that's created some of that idea that at least the Republican Party is the party of business, which is a longer tradition than to say the Republican Party is the party of conservatism, right? And both of those things have kind of lived in the conservative Republican space simultaneously. And that also leads to, I think, very different relationships between whether or not the Republican Party is the party of free markets or whether it's the party of business.
So there's a sort of interesting Venn diagram with all of this and different overlaps and things. I guess I might be a little too biased, but I'll ask anyways. I really agree. I think George Nash's work in this has been really useful for me, but to kind of think about this as something starting post-war, it allows for a little more clarity versus the kind of mixed bag issues that may have existed before. And I remember even studying Teddy Roosevelt as a younger guy. I was just kind of like a real nerdy kid and was a diehard Reaganite, what I considered movement conservative when I was a real little guy. And reading Teddy Roosevelt and being really confused that it was the same party, and of course at one point it became not the same party, but estate tax and antitrust busting and some of these things that I didn't identify with how I think about my own movement. But Buckley and National Review, it seems to me, at least in the modern era, helps timeline-wise with a start in 1955 of kind of a movement conservatism that was somewhat fusionist and anti-communist and definitely had a social dimension to it, but also was pro-market and pro-freedom, and I would think somewhat compatible with what you and I would refer to as classical liberalism. Would you say that from a movement ideology standpoint, not necessarily the different personalities over the years, that in the post-war conservatism, that crony capitalism was something embraced by certain parts of the Republican Party, by Rockefeller Republicans, by moderates or rhinos, that kind of thing? Or do you think even the sort of orthodoxy of conservatism has struggled with differentiating between being pro-market and pro-business? And I think even back to Adam Smith, who obviously was not short on exhortations about this issue, but since we're kind of talking about the more modern history of conservatism, where do you think those things line up?
Yeah. So I guess I would say that, the more you study the evolution of the parties, the more strange the past looks, right? So this is just by preface of way to answer your question, right? Even if you think about an issue that's sideways to what we're talking about now, if you think about abortion, right? As early as, going back to 1970, it was probably the case that anti-abortion was more a thing in the Democratic Party than it was in the Republican Party, right? Some of the strongest supporters of abortion rights were Republicans, right? There's George H.W. Bush was attacked in one of his first races for Congress. They called him Rubbers because he was, and that was not uncommon, right? That there was a certain kind of especially Northeastern Republican who was skeptical of immigration, who was in favor of population control, which was a thing. That's also an issue we don't talk about today. Was a big issue at some point and connected a certain kind of immigration opposition and pro-environmentalism, right? So again, there's lots of strange stuff and are not very far past that makes our current ideological categories look very weird. I would say that I actually think opposition to cronyism, in a way, through American history, has been something that's cut across our ideological categories. So if you go back again to the early 70s, which is, again, such an interesting era, you look at the deregulation of trucking, the deregulation of airlines, a whole bunch of those areas. There you had coalitions between often free marketers, right? But Ralph Nader was incredibly supportive of a lot of those deregulations because he saw all of those sort of protective regulations that we had of those industries as anti-consumer, right? And even today, right? I mean, that sometimes and every third day, Elizabeth Warren sort of sounds a little bit like this. So Niskanen, we worked with her on a bill to deregulate the sale of hearing aids, right? And that was a case where the hearing aid industry, right, a lot of them liked the fact that you had to get a prescription and do it through an audiologist, and so I think there's always been a kind of second dimension, a hidden second dimension in American politics, where the opposition to cronyism connects up free marketers' concerns for competition and people on the left's worry about concentrations of wealth and the way that government encourages that.
So I read an article that you had written, I want to say it's 5 or 6 years ago, but it could even be longer, at National Affairs about this issue of, redistribution was a theme in it, but it was really about wealth inequality and what the various tactics that were going to be necessary to address it. And you point out that the trade-off that many on the right have generally accepted was that to get more growth, you will likely get more inequality. My view has always been that that's probably true, and yet when you're getting more growth, the inequality is just simply historically not a major issue. That the political noise and toxicity around inequality is much more dampened when GDP growth, when real GDP growth is north of 3 or 4%. And I use it to make the point that right now we're living in a secular period of very muted economic growth. In fact, averaging half of our historical post-war average, 1.6 for the last 15 years versus 3.1 since World War II. And that, lo and behold, wealth inequality has exploded as a public issue. Before we get into some of the really astute points you make about what exacerbates wealth inequality and what could be done to address it, do you think I'm right or wrong in that assessment, that the mere existence of wealth inequality tends to not be as large of an issue when poor people are getting richer, regardless of the pace at which rich people are getting richer?
Yeah, so in the book, we argue, and the article in National Affairs was sort of an early version of this. In fact, if I give you a little bit of the history of the book, The Captured Economy, both myself and Brink Lindsay, who at that time was a vice president at the Cato Institute and now is my colleague at the Niskanen Center, had both written pieces separately that made a very similar point. And Brink and I had actually been running these regular dinners in D.C. called our libertarian dinners that brought people on the left and right together for regular discussions. And so at some point we decided that we had actually sort of co-evolved so much we should just write a book together, right? And that's the book that we did in the Captured Economy. And one of the basic insights we had there was that there's very different kinds of inequality, right? There's inequality that's generated by creative destruction, by the spontaneous order of the market. But most economies across the world, in fact, do have very large amounts of government regulation of various sorts. And I always talk about this as the conservative paradox. On the one hand, conservatives complain that there's so much regulation out there, right? And it's distorting the economy and it's having all these effects. And on the other hand, they think their historical role is to legitimate and justify inequality, right? And I say, well, the problem is these two things can't both be true, right? If regulation is as big and as distorting as conservatives say, you would think it would have to show up in the distributional tables, right? And if it's showing up in the distributional tables, there's no reason to think that conservatives necessarily have to think their role as legitimating the scale of inequality we have, because a lot of that inequality is in fact being generated by government, right? And so in that sense, what we were trying to do is cut across the normal way that we talk about inequality, right? That is usually people on the left say, oh yeah, there's all this inequality. It's all being produced by the market, and therefore we need less market. right? But in fact, if lots of that inequality is being produced by government, and there are traditions in the left that focus on this, actually more anarchist kind of traditions often focus on government as being the enemy, right? It's the, going back to Marx, it's the executive committee of the ruling class, right? Then it's possible within the kind of stories that people on the right tell about markets to still believe that the scale of inequality we have is a problem. In particular, it's a problem for legitimating all the inequality that in fact is being generated by the market, right? Because it's all in the distributional tables, it's all mixed up together. It's not segmented off. And when people get mad at inequality, they don't talk about the government only produced inequality on one side and the market produced on the other. It all ends up getting, and this is what I think why this generates populism, right? Is it just becomes against the elites. It becomes against the people who are actually operating the market and doesn't make this distinction.
And so that becomes, well, first of all, that seems natural, right? Human nature is not very interested in the weeds when there's moments of resentment and envy. The details and parsing out that distinction between market-driven and governmental-driven, it would be a tall order to expect someone in that position to kind of make those distinctions. So that doesn't seem like a big surprise. But then on the other hand, I suppose it makes the burden higher for people like us that care about the issue and are trying to do thoughtful work around it, and maybe even, God forbid, propose some constructive policy solutions to it. Diagnosing the problem correctly may not be natural for a person in the midst of resentment and frustration, but for policymakers or think tankers or what have you, it seems that that's an important distinction if we're going to do this constructively and not merely tribally.
Well, I guess I do think that actually this distinction does come more naturally, right? That is, I do think that, when there's an era when people think that inequality is being generated by cronyism, by special deals, by the idea that the people who are getting wealthy didn't really earn it, right? But that they stole it or they got it because they had, particular relationships. And one of the things we were trying to say in the book is that instinct is right? That instinct that actually we shouldn't just bend the knee and defer to those who happen to be wealthy because they earned everything that they have, right? There's a lot of, unearned wealth out there, and people should be angry about it, right? People shouldn't actually be patted on the head and told that they shouldn't be concerned about it. And I think a lot of in part, right, we could get into this further, right? But, there's issues well beyond what we talk about in the book about taxation, right? When you look at especially state level taxation, which we can get into, there's huge cronyism. Anytime anybody's building any project anywhere today, they more or less cut a special deal with a local government to negotiate what their taxes should be. And when you aggregate all that up, right, all the regulatory, distortion, the tax distortion, all these other things, I think people, they don't always, like think tankers, they don't have that carefully parsed, but they do have a sense that those who are already wealthy are using their advantages to reproduce their wealth. And that actually is a fundamental and correct economic insight.
And so how would you correct that insight? What would be the low-hanging fruit to clear up that misperception?
Well, so one thing I would say again is it's a correct perception that there's a lot of unearned wealth out there, and that there's a lot of what you might think of as just simple class reproduction, right? That a lot of the
and you're using the term unearned in the most simple of senses, not necessarily as a pejorative.
I'm using it pretty pejoratively, yeah. I mean, in the sense that I think that
we should think of a trust fund kid as a evil actor.
Well, I don't know evil, but I think as a social phenomenon. And again, I'm not really talking about trust funds exactly here in terms of intergenerational wealth, right? But one of the basic insights, I think, going all the way back to the origins of markets, right, is that actual markets have some processes that can reduce inequality, right? That is, the basic idea is that supernormal profits attract competition.
Right.
And in a well-working market system, those supernormal profits can only last so long unless the incumbents are able to prevent competitors from coming in, right?
Yeah.
And so all the way, and that's one way to think about what's the distinction between earned and unearned, right? The earned is that original profit somebody makes because they see an opportunity that nobody had. So for a while, they're making a supernormal profit. The unearned part is where they can use government to keep people from coming in and sort of pushing those returns down to a normal level of profit, right? So that's one way to think about earned and unearned, right? And the more that you have that, the more you have the sort of.
But I want to be clear, even though I know the answer, just for listeners, you're not suggesting that economic actors who are really good at beating their competition and keeping margins high from ongoing innovation and performance, that's the problem. You're specifically referring to the unnatural maintaining of margins and in a competition-free zone by betting up with the government.
Yes, right. So if you go back to, I gave the example of the airlines back in the day, right? There was a time not that long ago when basically nobody could create a new airline, right? At least a new airline to do interstate competition, right? There was a certain set of airlines. You had a civil aeronautics board that determined routes, that determined prices, that determined everything, right? And so there was no opportunity for competition in that system, right? Until we deregulated, and then suddenly we had a lot of competition. And it turns out that for the last, as an investor, for the last 40 years or something, there's been actually almost no profit in the airline industry. But I think that suggests that in a free market, the level of profit does drift down unless someone can find a durable and recurrent source of competitive advantage. And that durable competitive advantage is something you want out of markets, right? And this is why, again, from Baumol, right, that even where there isn't actual competition, where there's the possibility of competition, you still have that spur to innovation. And so I think you really should distinguish those two things, right? And that's the distinction between what you might think of as good capitalism and bad capitalism.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in principle that a lot of people can agree with the distinction, but then in practice maybe have different rulings in certain matters of application. I think about like the Microsoft example with the software business. The reality is I can't think of a real specific way in which it was cronyism that enabled them to develop a 93% market share of operating system and enterprise, right, application, and yet they had it, and they were pretty relentless in protecting it, and so there's a kind of gray area, I guess, between when a company sort of acts like gangsters, but not with government, not with violence, not with even the regulatory state, but just sort of leverage of internal assets to protect that. And I think those are tougher for me than the very clear utilization of regulatory state as a means of keeping out intruders into your business.
I think antitrust that's a complicated question. And in Microsoft, I do think actually in retrospect, we still actually don't know exactly what would have happened if there hadn't, in a world in which the antitrust suit had never happened, right? Microsoft would have done a lot of different things. Maybe that created space for a lot of the firms that came in when they were a little frozen as to how aggressive they could be. We don't really know that, but we actually don't address antitrust in the book because we think there's a lot of cleaner examples, right? Whether it's intellectual property, whether it's in various forms in finance. The clearest ones are in medicine, right? In the doctor cartel. All of those things are really clean examples of being able to lock in either your as an individual or your as a profession advantage against competition, and therefore to drive up to simultaneously drive up your own returns. And as we argue, to prevent economic growth, right? Because one of the basic things we say is, economists love creative destruction, but no actual businesses like it, right? That is, everybody's trying to, every incumbent, the one thing they absolutely want to avoid is creative destruction.
Yeah. So what are the examples in the medical side that you think of as kind of clear examples of an inappropriate use of leverage to avoid competition? Credentialing, and when you say IP, do you have a critique wholesale of our patent system?
Yeah, so just to go back to medicine, so my favorite and I think the clearest example is dentistry, right? So you think about dentistry, and lots of areas of medicine have sort of scope of practice rules, right? About what it is that only a dentist can do, right? But most people know, right, when you go to the dentist, right, you are usually met by the receptionist. She then takes you to the dental hygienist. You spend almost all your time with the dental hygienist. She does your x-rays. She cleans your teeth. She looks it over. And then a dentist comes in for a few minutes, sort of waves across over you, looks at you, and then walks off, right? And that's it, right? But the important thing to say is, in most states, that dental hygienist is literally legally required to operate in a dentist office, right? So she cannot get together with other dental hygienists and create her own business of doing all that cleaning and simply refer people over for fillings or other things, right? And this is a very bad joke coming, but it essentially means that the dentist is able to extract a rent out of the dental hygienist, right? Uh-huh. Because the dental hygienist has to work in his, or it usually is his office, right? This is the case where actually gender does go over the labor market. Most of the dentists are men, most of the dental hygienists are women. They could be setting up offices in the mall to do all that, and then they could be taking all the profits. But the regulations mean that the dentist is actually getting a lot of that business and it also means that he's charging more from it because he doesn't actually have to face competition from an alternative business model. And that same story is true over huge amounts of the medical profession, right? Where they can protect themselves, first of all, by scope of practice rules about the kind of things that only a doctor can do. But in fact, lots of things that actually nurses can do perfectly well. That locks in business models about exactly how we organize healthcare that we could organize in a very different way, but we don't. Also, doctors are protected from international competition, right? So everybody else in the labor market, and this goes back to some of that resentment. People know, right? People who worked in industrial areas, right, know that they were competing with China, but doctors are able to effectively almost completely control the number of doctors trained somewhere else who can come and practice in the United States. And that allows them to charge much more than they are, right? So we've gotten perfectly comfortable with international protectionism in licensed professions, whereas we've gotten rid of most of the protectionism where industrial occupations are concerned.
So what about the drug business, pharmaceutical? Do you feel that patent laws are problematic in this space?
Yeah. So the thing, and again, I think patents in medicine are the most complicated of all the things in the intellectual property space, right? I think there's a lot of other areas where long copyrights and music and books and things are just literally a huge waste. And the argument we make in the book, and actually that Brink Lindsay and Daniel Takish have made at length, is it's really important to realize that the term intellectual property is just a total misnomer, right? It'd be better to think of it as intellectual protectionism, right? Because what it basically is a protection against competition. Now, there are some times when that makes sense, right? But it's mostly a very pragmatic matter about there's a certain number of drugs we want to be able to come to market, and what system does that, right? Providing intellectual property through patents is one kind of government produced, form of subsidy we could use. We could also use prizes, right? That we could give people prizes up front for developing a drug. We could have guaranteed purchase orders of the kind that we did for COVID rules, right? But all of them are equally interventions in the market, right? Their patents are not somehow innocent of being a protection from the market. It's just one other way that we do in order to get the outcome we want.
In fairness, I think I disagree with you, but I may not. But I'm going to pretend I do for the sake of argument. In fairness, the point you're making does require a begging of the question, right? Because the intervention that is intellectual property protection, a patent, to refer to it as an intervention and one of the different tactics that could be used to facilitate an effective, delivery of new drugs to the market that help meet human needs and all these good things. It presupposes that the maker of the drug is not entitled to some property protection, right? Like we wouldn't, and of course, I agree. The burden of proof would be on the intellectual property creator that they are entitled to that protection. But I think that the argument is that the incentive to the profit motive that serves as an incentive to go create world-changing, life-changing, life-enhancing drugs and treatments is diminished if one believes that the property can be taken via reverse engineering immediately when it's out the door, and that it would be a negative social effect across the board if that incentive were lost. And so to refer to it as an intervention requires us to believe that intellectual property protection didn't exist to begin with, which maybe it doesn't, but we wouldn't refer to it as some sort of special gift when the state enforces physical property protections.
Well, let me just give you an example. So, one of the reasons why we might be skeptical of intellectual protectionism, which is what my preferred term, right, is just use the example of restaurants, right? So restaurants can't get intellectual property on recipes, right? So somebody goes and Gordon Ramsay starts a new restaurant. He creates some sort of gold flaked duck leg with, human blood in it or whatever, right? He creates that and everyone's like, oh, this is so great. And somebody else starts doing the same thing. Gordon Ramsay can't sue them. Now, if he puts it in a cookbook, that's a slightly different question, right? But basically, restaurants can use anybody's innovation immediately, right, without the possibility of lawsuits. And that's one of the reasons why we have such enormous creativity in the restaurant business, is people are constantly innovating, creating things, and then people can immediately use them, put them together, right? The same thing is true in fashion, right? That's one of the reasons why fashion is so creative and why things so quickly move from the Paris runway to, Ross Dressed for Less, right? Because you don't have that intellectual property protection. It's one of the reasons why when I was a kid.
But we do with fashion, right? Like you can have a dress that both look the same way or cut the same way, and there's no protection against that. But, David and Steven's new clothing line can't put Prada on our outfit. We can't, there are intellectual property protections that keep us from branding it as if it were our own. And even if we tried to do Gordon Ramsay's new fancy recipe, if he doesn't give it to us, we still have to do the work to guess what went into it. Whereas with pharma, the reverse engineering is a bit more of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Although, even in pharma, it obviously depends on what you're doing, right? One of the issues with the COVID vaccines is even if the basic, the nature of the molecule was clear and everything, right, that it was incredibly hard to produce, right? There was a lot of tacit knowledge and capital stuff you had to do to actually produce it. So, even without the intellectual property protection, people wouldn't be able to go and start producing them in Indian pharma factories. So that's a separate question. But I think one of the points I have is the thing you said was it's a question about incentive, right? That is, we want a certain amount of creativity, right? We want have people to be able to creatively repurpose, take stuff, use it in a different way. and then create something new, right? And that is at odds with intellectual property, right? Because the more that people have a lot of property, the less that people can creatively repurpose things and recombine them in new ways, right? And then there's transaction costs associated with all of that, right? And so it, in some sense, especially in pharma, is a really pragmatic question of how you want to design the market, because nobody thinks we ought to have a system that's just completely a free-for-all, and so I think that's one of the basic problems there in pharma, right? And again, that's why.
So there's going to be trade-offs.
It's a trade-off because I think it's an inherently government-created market, right? And I think this is another general area is this is certainly not a state of nature kind of market, right? These are markets that have to be created, right? And they have whatever competition you create in the market you design, right? But it's not like just the thing where somebody goes in their backyard and builds an apple tree and plants it and then sells somebody apples in front of their yard. It's a much different kind of government-produced market.
Well, and I guess the fact that what you're saying is true is evidenced by the fact that these patents expire, and we do have a generic drug industry, a multi-billion-dollar generic industry. And so there is some gray area and complexity in it, even evidenced by the fact that we don't treat it apples to apples, no pun intended from your prior analogy, to physical property, right? So one's use and legal right to exploitation of their own physical property doesn't expire.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing I would say about pharma, but in other areas is, you've got a basic choice about how you want to compensate the person for producing that good and therefore give them the incentive, right? If you give them all the money up front and say, okay, great, you invented something, here's $10 billion, but then anybody can use that innovation in any way they want right on day one, right? Well, obviously you're going to get a lot of innovation because people are going to take whatever you produced out of that and recombine it, use it in a different way, right? And then, whereas if you have a patent, right, then nobody can use that innovation, or at least there's the possibility they're going to get sued for patent infringement. And that's going to slow down the diffusion of innovation. And the diffusion of innovation is one of the most important things that people like us like about markets, right? But this is the thing that's literally designed to prevent the diffusion of innovation.
Yeah. So the credentialing side, the rule, your dental hygienist example is fascinating. I've been involved with Stand Together and what the Kochs have done over the years, and they've brought a lot of awareness around some of the silliest things, and yet it's just an absolutely insidious industry about the protectionism that takes place with things like hairdressers and other kind of local businesses and markets that quite literally are designed to hurt the little guy or little gal, the hair braiding, credentialing and some of this stuff. And we laugh about it. It seems silly, but it's keeping people from making a living. And so those are areas that I think are really legitimate example of a business using a relationship with the state to ward off competition. But when you talk about it in the macro, which is what we are talking about when we talk about wealth and equality, would you argue that subsidies are a huge part of this? And so we look now, the two examples that come up, I teach an economics course at a local Christian high school in Southern California, and I don't know that anyone has used Bill Gates' name or even Steve Jobs' name. These guys are either old or, in Steve's case, gone. It's Bezos and it's Musk, and that we talk about as sort of the alleged, kind of oligarchs of today. And I don't know what the crony component would have been for Amazon as an e-com player until cloud and until their ability to blend AWS in the mix. And I know we don't really want to go into antitrust because that actually wasn't my intent in having you on. Some of this stuff kind of seems to go there. But do you think subsidies, Musk famously got a lot of subsidies. There's a lot of people that aren't worth one comma of Elon Musk's net worth that also got subsidies with electric vehicles, and they haven't done anything. Where do you think subsidies fit into feeding this problem of markets in bed with government driving wealth inequality?
Yeah, let me go back to the beginning of what you were saying. So you're using and I'm actually uncomfortable with mixing what I'm talking about with sort of little guyism.
Okay.
Right? Because there's a lot of little guys who deserve to be crushed and ground into the ground.
Totally.
Into the right? And so just a couple of my examples is when you look at the who's in the 1%, I say, you go all the way to the top, you got Jeff Bezos, right? And then you get to the sturdy yeomanry of the 1%, right? The people who are at the kind of the bottom of the 1%. There are a lot of like car dealers down there, right? Now, pretty much that entire industry is an artifact of government regulation, right? Not the car industry, but the car sales is because we have franchise laws that are at the state level that require car companies to sell through franchisees, right? You got rid of those laws, and Tesla, just to speak of Elon Musk, right, has bumped up against those because he wanted to sell direct to consumers, right? But you got rid of those laws, and you would eliminate a lot of inequality, right? But you would create a lot of consumer surplus, right? Because the car dealers would be able to sell direct to consumers. The same thing is true of undertakers, right? There's all kind of these protective where it's actually hard for big, consolidated companies. Walmart can't just come in and say, I'm going to undercut your local undertaker, right? Walmart, right? We're going to have lower prices for death every day, right? They can't do that, right? But it would make a lot of sense, right? It actually turns out that there are huge profits in that industry because they're so protected from competition. But that's a thing that actually leads to markets being more fractured than they ought to be, right? Now, on the other side, just to use the Amazon example, I always find it weird that people wrap Amazon, and again, AWS is a somewhat different issue. But it may be actually connected to some of these other things because they're collecting lots of data through their sales that may relate to, but put that aside. But in general, almost every market Amazon goes into, they create more competition, right? They don't dominate almost any of the sectors that they're in, right? What they're doing is they're pushing down the profits of Best Buy. They're pushing down the profits of grocers. When they go into pharmacy, right? They're pushing down the profits of CVS, right? And so in general, that's why I think the big small has always been a distinction that's left me cold, because sometimes what regulation does is it artificially fractures and cartelizes for the little guy, right? Which was a big part of the regulation in the 1930s. In the 1940s, right, was actually artificially cartelizing industries and protecting small banks, small producers, that was a lot of the anti-franchising laws and those other kinds of things. So I think I don't
think that my point was that this is a matter of big guy versus little guy. I think it was that there are examples. I think that whether the actor is big or small, I'm referring to the actor who is seeking, who is rent seeking, who is trying to utilize the arm of government as a competitive edge in their business. And that person doing that could be a small business owner. On a local politics level, there are these things that with like Amazon coming to town and wanting subsidies and credits to come build a warehouse. But the worst actors locally are generally very small and local businesses that want carve-outs from hotel taxes and other things like this. And so, yeah, my sinisterism is against big and small. I was using the hair braider analogy merely to point out where a small business actor is a victim, not the perpetrator.
Right. Well, the only thing I would say is, the only reason that as the kids say now, I'm triggered about this is that people often use it because there's a lot of sentiment around the little guy, or there's sentiment around small business. And certainly, like, I love In Suit for Justice. I love what they do, right? But they clearly try and, their usual client is some scruffy, person who's a one-man band who's starting something out, right? And I think sometimes that actually gives us, the people who actually are rent seekers often draw on that same kind of sentiment.
Absolutely.
Right? Of preferring small rather than big. But I do think small versus big does matter when you were talking about the sort of carved outs from taxation. It is the case that the larger the business is, the more successful usually they are at getting government to give them carve out from taxation. So when you have larger businesses, they're trying to decide whether to cite some production. Instead of just having neutral tax rules that are there on the books, they go around each jurisdiction and they say, let's make a deal, right? Now, again, going back and reading my Hayek says that's not the way to run a railroad, right? You want neutral laws applied neutrally across all cases. And it's generally larger industries that are able to do that. So Nate Jensen is a friend of mine who's at University of Texas and a fellow at the Niskanen Center, has done incredible research looking at the growth and the scope of these sort of local property tax exceptions. And it's just huge. It's been a huge explosion of it. And I think this is actually a great area for both people on the more libertarian side in economics and people on the left to work together on, because on the one hand, they're sort of eating away at the tax base of local government because they have to hand this out because all their other jurisdictions are all handing it out, right? And it means that we don't actually have a real, just pure rule of law market in operation.
So would your view be that the proper Hayekian solution would be equal treatment for all businesses coming into a certain locality, and hopefully it's favorable for business and competitive and enough to meet the revenue needs of the city for their services that they offer? It isn't hard to define what a friendly atmosphere looks like around regulation and tax cost and whatnot, but that it be even, so that Amazon and Hilton and that little guy, so to speak, there I go again, are all paying the same rate.
Right. So I think the basic idea would be that, that we can have competition between jurisdictions, but it's competition on their generic rules of the road, right? What's their level of public services? What's the quality of their public services? What's the level of their taxation for all investment, right? That I think is mostly a okay, and in many cases even wholesome form of competition, right? It's the competition for carve-outs for specific actors, right? Where you're no longer in a rule of law context, right? Because you're not treating likes alike, which is a basic principle of what it means to have a rule of law applied to economic activity.
Yeah, it's a wonderful insight. Look, I think we ought to do this again sometime. I think there's so much more we could unpack, and we're up against the time side now. But what I really want to do is post into the show notes some of the stuff you've written here, bring some awareness to the center, and allow people, I think, to think through some of this with more nuance. And hopefully we could do another discussion sometime. These are issues near and dear to our heart at Capitol Record, and I think we make for a more robust free enterprise system when we think through this cogently.
Thanks a lot, David. I appreciate it.
I'm going to put the article that I referenced that I was talking about with Steven in the show notes, but there really is so much more he and I could have unpacked. We went down a little bit of the rabbit hole there about pharma and patents and intellectual property, but it was relevant to what we were talking about. But as you can see, there's just a lot of thoughtful contributions he has to this topic. And I think that this is an area it behooves us to be nuanced in, to be thoughtful, to not jump merely into rhetoric. You saw even the rhetoric about the little guy is something he pushed back on. And of course, you guys know me well enough to know that I don't have a populist bone in my body, but even the way in which someone could use that vocabulary sometimes to poison the well, he rightly pushed back on. And I think that that's the kind of stuff I love about his work is he's not looking to fit into a particular box. He's really doing very honest scholarship, but nevertheless valuable in our movement that is rooted in a defense of these things. So that defense of free enterprise, I'm going to keep working on. If you missed my opening act about the new course at bahnsen.com, check that out. I'll spare you repeating it again. And if you are enjoying what you hear on Capitol Record, I can't ask you enough for your support to rate us, review us, say good things about us, and subscribe on your player of choice. It really helps quite a bit as we get the word out. And that word is the defense of free enterprise towards the aim of a free and virtuous society. Thank you for listening to the Capitol Record.